Woodsong, Chapter 2 by Gary Pualsen. Considering the enormous effect dogs have had on my life, I came to them late, and in an odd enough way. I was 40 years old and living in poverty when I first became involved with sled dogs. Writing is a strange way to make a living, and I had sold many books by the time I was 40, but was not making enough money to live on it. I worked construction, ran heavy equipment, tracked satellites, taught, did many things to support life, and by the time I was 40, I was working very hard and had become almost completely broke, living with my wife and son in a small cabin in northern Minnesota with no plumbing, no electricity, and no real prospects. And so to dogs. The state of Minnesota was having a rough time with beavers. They had more or less run amok and were damming up rivers and flooding highways, filling pastures, even beginning to invade the cities. I had trapped a bit when I was a boy, and to make some good money I decided to trap for the state. The state paid a small bounty, and the pelt brought a similar small amount of money. It was a one-man operation, and not very successful because I ran it on foot or on a pair of skis when the snow came, and I rarely got over a 20-mile trap line. There was also the difficulty that I had trouble even then with trapping and killing. I was not good at it because I did not really want to do it. Some friends heard of my trapping and gave me 4 older dogs. They were Storm, Yogi, Obi, and Columbia, and a broken sled. The side rails were broken and needed replacement, and so I was into dogs. But of course, I was not. I did not know how to run them or be run by them. I did not even know how to harness them or to hook them properly to the gang line that pulled the sled when they were harnessed. But I fixed the sled and tried to harness them, and that first time I did not know about, anything. The dogs more or less wandered around the yard without leaving, and I thought it was madness to even try to use them when the only way they would leave the yard was for me to drag them. After a time, I stopped and sat on a stump and watched them and tried to think of a way to make them run. Finally, I decided you couldn't make them. You had to let them. One of the dogs, Obi, seemed to be trying to look ahead, and I thought he might want to pull the others, lead them. So I put him in front, and it worked. We left the yard and ran on a trail through the woods, and I thought all the Yukon King thoughts there are. I was running a team in the north, and they were out there ahead of me, and it was beautiful. And I knew nothing. I was so ignorant, so steeped in not knowing, that I did not even know what I didn't know. I didn't know what questions to ask or how to ask them, and I would not begin to learn until Storm taught me. His blood taught me. There will be more about running dogs later, and more about Storm, but for the moment it is enough to know that when I started, I thought I knew what I was doing. The dogs moved for me. I expanded the trap line to nearly 60 miles over the next 3 months. By the middle of hard winter, I thought I was Sergeant Preston, a mountaineer on a radio show I had listened to as a child. By this time, I had 3 more dogs, a 7-dog work team, and a tent. Obi had evolved into something I thought was a good leader. I think it was largely because he looked like a sled dog should look, like a Sergeant Preston kind of sled dog. He was large and wolf-like, with a thick gray mane and a tail that curled over his back. He was standoffish. He did not want to be petted. Now and again he would lift his lip at me, and twice he bit me on the leg. Obi always wanted to fight other males, and I thought, mistakenly, that all of this was proper behavior for a sled dog. At least the Yukon King type of sled dog I had always dreamed about. I wasn't trapping very much, and I was running a long distance. It took 3 days to run the 60-mile line, but I confined my running to the daylight. I did not know about using a headlamp, did not know that the dogs ran better at night. I would run during the day, work on my set traps, then pitch a tent and camp at night, and harness up and run the next day. And there was great beauty in that, sleeping with them. I would fix the tent and arrange my sleeping bag and pad, and then put the dogs around me in a circle just outside the firelight. On truly cold nights, when it dropped to 10 or 15 below, I would bring several of the dogs into the tent and pack them around the bag tightly and fall asleep with them breathing around me, with their hearts beating against me through the bag, with their souls in the tent with me. They also felt the warmth and would move in closer against the bag, jamming into the sides. On one very cold night, it must have been 30 or 35 below, I awakened in the morning with dogs all around me and 3 of them curled up on top of me, a living blanket. With all of this closeness, with all of the running, with the dance of the dogs, I thought I knew them. And with that thought, with that attitude, I wasn't learning anything. I just ran a line, took a beaver now and then, and pretended somewhere in my mind that I was Sergeant Preston and had a whole team of kings out in front of me, until Storm taught me. There came a night finally when I was about 20 miles from home, and it was very cold, close to 40 below, and rather than spend the night out camping, I decided to run in the dark and go on home. Running sled dogs is much like sailing a boat on the ocean. Distances are almost critically relative. Sailing 100 miles with the wind might take 12 or 14 hours depending on the wind strength, boat, and sailor. To turn around and sail the same 100 miles against the wind, and especially if there is a current against you, might take 1, even 2 weeks. Indeed, sometimes it simply can't be done. Ever. Dogs are much the same. 20 miles with a work team traveling 7 miles an hour, which is about average, would seem to take about 3 hours, and sometimes does. But an inch of new snow to slow the sled or an extra heavy load to slow it still more, perhaps a headwind to cap it, and the dogs can only make 3 or 4 miles an hour. Suddenly, the trip, the same 20 miles, becomes 5, 6, or even a 7-hour run. And on a 7-hour run with a heavy load, it is necessary to stop and rest the dogs. Let them sleep for a couple hours and feed them, so that adds still more. All of these things were against me. A run I thought would take 3 hours was in reality going to take me closer to 9 hours, all in the dark and intense cold, in new snow and what turned out to be hilly country, with a sled that weighed close to 500 pounds fully loaded. It became one of the longest nights of my life. I did not understand at that time that you should feed the dogs straight raw meat and fat. It is the same as putting gasoline in an engine. Some people actually told me that meat was bad for them and to only feed them dry dog food. I had a sack of dog food with me and fed that to them when I stopped to camp. All wrong, all of it. What I did not know then is not only should the dogs be fed meat and fat, but they most decidedly should not be fed dry dog food when they are going to work hard or be stressed at all. The bits of ground corn used as a base for the dog food are worthless and largely indigestible, and they are very sharp. When a working dog's stomach tightens, as it does when he pulls, the corn becomes like tiny little knives that cut and tear the insides of his intestines. I knew none of this, and so to Storm. Storm was an almost classic sled dog. He looked much like a brindle wolf with beautifully slanted eyes. He had a great reach to his front legs and a thick mane and a straight back. In many ways, he was still very primitive, but he liked people a great deal and would lean against your leg to be petted. He pooled. Of course, they all pool. It is genetic, so old code or command that it has become part of what sled dogs are, the fiber of their very being. When they are 6 months old, you harness them and they pool. There's no training necessary. It just is. But some of them pool better than others. Storm pooled from somewhere within himself, from some primitive core so strong that he could not pool, even if he wanted to. He was also what is known as an honest dog. Some dogs pool, and when they get tired, they slack off, but they keep enough pull on the harness tug so it appears they are working while they are really resting. When they have rested for a quarter of a mile or so, they go back to work. It's not bad. It's very much one of those they know, you know, they know situations, and part of running dogs. But some dogs, and Storm was one of them, pull hard all the time, even when they are tired. These are called honest dogs, and they are key to running, somehow more than the other dogs. So into this night, in my ignorance, we started to run. Into what I thought would be a 3 or 4 hour easy run, we started. And it was not so bad at first. Part of it showed me new beauty. There was a full moon, and when we first started the night run, we went across a lake, a beautiful, long lake in the moonlight. The moonlight off the snow and the cold air was so bright and flat white, you could have read a book, and the dogs worked wonderfully in the cold. At the end of the lake, there was a large hill. The base of the hill was heavily forested, and the trail wound through the trees. As the dogs moved through the dark shadows of the forest and climbed the hill, we went through some strange kind of temperature inversion. And just as they came back out into the moonlight, into the flat white light at the top of the hill, the steam from their collective breath came up and over their backs and hid them. When dogs run, they are silent. Only in the movies do they rattle and bark while they are running. So, in silence, all in silence, except for the gentle huffing of their breath and the slight jingle of their harness snaps, I was pulled over the top of the open hill in the moonlight by Steam Ghost. It was heart-stoppingly beautiful, and that was part of that run. We ran down from the hill through some country that a tornado had ripped and torn. For 6 or 7 miles, the trail wound through the wreckage and down trees and broken limbs. It was hard going, with the new snow and frequently having to stop and chop through down trees with an axe, then hump the sled over them, hacking and swearing and pushing, the dogs slamming and jerking and pulling until finally we got through, and we were in calm forest again, winding through thick spruce trees, in and out of dappled moonlight and beauty. The sweat was freezing on the outside of my clothes as it steamed out, so I had to stop and scrape it off with a stick, and suddenly, for no reason that I knew, Storm sprayed blood. In the moonlight, I could not tell that it was blood, but only something dark that sprayed out of his rear end. Storm was directly in front of the sled in the wheel position, a term that dates back to the stagecoaches, and it covered the front end of the sled and the sides of the trail, a sudden dark liquid. I stopped the sled and tied it off to a tree. I thought he had developed diarrhea, which was bad enough, and I ran up to his side. He stood normally, slamming into the harness to get the sled moving. The temperatures had dropped still more, and the dogs all wanted to run. They worked to the cold, the colder the better. The smell was strong. As I kneeled next to him, near the stain in the snow, the smell was wrong for what I thought it was. I lit a match and was horrified to see blood. Storm was spraying bright red blood out of his rear end. Blood covered the sled and the trail. I had never seen this, known this before, had never hurt a dog before. And now this? All the dogs were screaming high-pitched, deafening screams because they were impatient and wanted to run, knowing that they were headed in the direction of home. Storm ignored me and kept screaming and lunging to go as if nothing were wrong. And each time he lunged, blood squirted. I became frantic. In my life, blood meant something bad, something fiercely bad. Blood was an end. I didn't know what to do. I stood next to him and did not know what to do. Doctor, I thought. I need to get him to the doctor before he dies. And without any more pulling, I had to ease him down and get him to a doctor. That's all I could think. I unhooked him from the gangline and carried him, lunging and screaming to the sled. I tied him in the basket of the sled with a short piece of line to his collar. Then I stood on the runners and let the team loose. We didn't make it 50 yards before Storm went absolutely insane. When he looked ahead in the darkness and saw that the other dogs were pulling while he was riding on the sled, he went mad. He flopped and ripped and tore at the sled, at the rope holding him by the collar, at me, at the world, until he had worked himself off to the side of the sled and was pulling there, pulling with the rope on his collar, pulling so his neck was wrapped around back. I stopped and put him back on the sled and tried to start again, but it was no good. He immediately fought to get down again, screamed for it, and when he got down, he began to pull with his neck. I tied a longer rope, tried to let him trot along in the back, and that did not work either. He simply ran up alongside until the rope caught, then began to pull, his neck wrapped around to the side. They do not really know harness. When Captain Cook first saw Eskimos and their dogs in Alaska, they did not have harnesses. The dogs pulled from crude collars. Storm didn't care that he wasn't hooked in a harness. The collar would do fine. He pulled the way they have always pulled. And there it was. I could not stop because I thought if I waited too long to get him to a doctor, he would bleed to death. I could not get him to ride the sled because if I did, the exertion of his slamming around, trying to get back out and pull made him bleed all the more. I could not get him to trot easily along and back. Finally, in a kind of mad worry, I took off his harness and let him run free, thinking he might just follow us as we made our way through the darkness. Instead, he immediately ran up and around the sled and into his old position. He tried to pull even though he wasn't hooked to anything, and I thought for a moment that might work. At least he didn't have the weight of the sled to pull, but he bled anyway, and seemed to work hard anyway, and seemed to be pulling hard anyway. Because he wasn't hooked to anything, whenever there was some unevenness in the trail, he would lunge ahead and trip and nearly fall. When he stumbled, the sled almost ran over him, which almost certainly would have killed him. At last, I knew that I could do nothing but what he wanted to do: let him pull. It was a terrible thing to learn on that night because of his blood. Blood was so important to me, meant so much to me, and here it was, leaving him, and I thought his life was leaving him. Finally done, I put the harness back on him and hooked him up and made the run through the night, thinking I was allowing him to die. 7 more hours we ran. I stopped along the way to snack the dogs on dry food and bits of meat. They ate the snow, and Storm pulled. Across 2 rivers and several lakes, and through some sharp hills in the moonlight we ran, and Storm pulled, and I waited for him to end, hating myself for doing the only thing I thought I could do. But it was nothing to him. To Storm, it was all as nothing. The blood, the anxiety I felt, the horror of it meant as little to Storm as the blood from the deer on the snow had meant to the wolves. It was part of his life, and if he could only obey the one drive, the drive to be in the team and pull, then nothing else mattered. And he did not die. Later, when he was very old, Storm would teach me about death, but not that night. That night, he ran and we ran until just before dawn. I could see the glow from the Coleman lamp coming through the windows of the cabin across the swamp near our home. He never once faltered, and did not falter for 6 more years, never stopped pulling. I took the dogs out of harness and rubbed their shoulders and marveled at Storm, who stood with his tail wagging, not bleeding any longer. I put them on their chains so that they could get at the fresh straw in their houses to make soft beds, and I realized I had learned something again that night. I had learned that I knew absolutely nothing, the same lesson I learned from the wolves and the doe. Knew nothing about animals, understood nothing about the drives that make them work, knew nothing. I also learned, as with the wolves and the doe, that I wanted to know more, wanted to know everything there was to know about dogs and the woods and running with a team. But I had one more important lesson to learn first, and it would also be in blood.